Good morning, everybody. Um, I'm the last speaker of the conference, and I'm going to try and tie up some of the concepts we've learned into a comprehensive diagnostic and treatment protocol, with particularly the theme of the conference, One People, One Planet, One Health, and give you some idea of how I approach patients with complex issues and attempt to make sense, if you will, of some of the complexities and some of the multiple incoming bits of data and information that we often are asked to sort through. So this is a very common scenario. Patient presents at your office having seen many people, having tried many things, having researched, having been on the internet and is up to date with all the latest treatments, and then asks you things that you may or may not be familiar with. And you are left sort of wanting to know or thinking, how do I approach this patient, and what systems do I use, and what systems of inquiry do I use, what diagnostic protocols can I think of, and how do you proceed to make sense of this? It's very challenging. Where do we begin? The amount of misinformation out there is huge. Patient advocacy is welcomed, but often misdirected. There's often lots of single point causation. People think it's Lyme or mold or micelle. It's often it's often all those things and much more. And it's very difficult to penetrate and get into a patient's system of inquiry without sometimes ruffling feathers or offending people's points of view. It's a minefield sometimes, not always. Sometimes it's very pleasurable and very, it fills you with hope, and it sort of makes you realign with why you started to do this work in the first place. But sometimes it's very challenging. And the question that is the functional medicine integrative model adequate? Does it leave things out? What else can be considered? What other considerations can we bring into account when we're dealing with complex patients? And I hope to go over some of those today by presenting this data. By way of background, I was talking to Werner Vossler, a member of the ISEAI board, one day about complex patients and how I approached them. And he said, well, why don't you just present and let us show us what you do? So this is the basis of this presentation. Just a little bit by way of background, because it will make sense at the end why I chose to introduce some biographical information about how I arrived at this system. I was fortunate when, as a teenager, I had a rather complex childhood. And then I was sent to boarding school and had a high school teacher by the name of Roger, and he introduced me to many things, including the philosophical system of Vedanta and a particular subset of Vedanta called Advaita. And the relevance of this will be made clear a bit later. And he also introduced me to the writings and work of Carl Jung, whose book Memory, Dreams and Reflections was a seminal piece of work in my early exposure to philosophical systems. And Carl Jung was the first person to draw out the cartography of the psyche as told through his autobiographical narrative, which is a very fascinating reading. And he was also the first person to really say that the psyche, the inner world of people, has an objective reality. Although it's subtle and unseen, there are aspects to it that can be used and taken to be somewhat fixed and relied upon as a roadmap when you are working with people's unconscious material. He also said, along with many others, that the urge to or desire to be whole, or what he called individuated, or to integrate, to sort of to be healed, if you will, to know yourself. In the East, they call it enlightened. Maslow called it self-actualized. He said that this was an evolutionary urge. So everybody, desires to be the best they can be in the most integrated way. And this is evolutionary. So patients, although they may present with sickness and disease, there may be another directive that they are asking. And the question is, as medical practitioners, is this our responsibility? where do we enter into this complex system and what are our responsibilities? And I'll address these a bit later. So he said that, you know, the urge to be whole, the urge to be healed is evolutionary. The Advaita, with this Hindu system or the Vedantic system, is often translated as non-duality. A more apt translation is non-secondness, meaning that there's no other reality other than what they call Brahman in Hindu terms, that the reality as we see it through the five senses is not ultimately at its deepest core constituted by bits and pieces, by parts. That is, everything that's always changing in the universe, all these changing things, have no existence of their own, but they're all appearances of what they call the one, Brahman, the unmanifest field. And this is not that different from what the great quantum theorists of the last 150 years have said. They've also, they've said that behind this vast appearance of matter is this unified field of information and intelligence, which they call the quantum field, or light, if you will, which is infinite, eternal, and never changes. It's not subject to space, time, and present moment awareness. So, if you will, Advaita says that there is nothing to be made whole, as Jung said, because you already are whole. You just don't know it. You just don't wake up to that reality. It's a philosophical concept which we'll address and come back to. Now, ironically, the title of this conference is One People, One Planet, One Health. The very essence of Advaita, if you will. One mind, one manifestation. Everything is connected with everything else. Another bit of biographical data, which I'm just introducing in order to elaborate why I use this system, is that when I was younger, I had two major experiences of what they called Satori in Zen Buddhism, or Christ consciousness in Christianity, Fana in Sufism, Samadhi in yoga, whereby you directly experience this reality. When you directly experience this oneness, it's a very peculiar experience. It's not psychotic. You are very much in your body, but you really do see this unified field that underlies all matter. You really do see that past, present, and future are continuous. You really have no fear because you understand yourself to not be your ego squeezed into the confines of a body through space-time. You just experience this expanded state of awareness. And literally everything does appear to glow with a certain light. Quantum theorists will tell us that matter is nothing other than light squeezed down into matter. And that's the basis of quantum theory. So when you have these awakenings and these experiences, which many people have had through near-death experiences and precognitive dreams and synchronicities, etc., you definitely do experience that oneness that underlies all appearances of matter. It really is a different state of consciousness, but it actually, you resonate with it and believe it, know it to be true. So that was by way of some biographical data. After high school, I found myself in med school and became a family physician in Saskatchewan, and then started to be curious as to what other methods of healing and methods of inquiry could help patients when they presented to your office with symptoms. I happened to be exposed to a video by Larry Darcy, who you all may know, and he incorporated aspects of Eastern and Western medicine into his approach. And this evoked in me a memory of my childhood exposures to Eastern thought, and then launched a massive search for whatever it was that could assist patients to live at their maximum potential, not just treat symptoms, but live more fully. And so using my allopathic training as a basis, I then became curious, like many of you, and started to study beyond that allopathic model and studied TCM and acupuncture. Spent years with Deepak Chopra and David Simon studying Ayurveda. Went to India, did Ayurvedic internship in Pune, and studied all, did my IFM training, A4M training, spent years with, and still do, listen and study with some of the great leaders in biological medicine, Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt, many others in the field, and I've studied with Lawrence Afrin and Shoemaker and others like many of you. Dr. Horowitz in the Lyme world, William Walsh in the mental health field. But it was ultimately sort of provoked into thinking about integrating theories by the works of Ken Wilber and his so-called integral theory of everything. He sort of combines all these areas of thought and philosophical systems into one unified system. Theoretical, but not practical. So what I attempted to do was make practical his theoretical system. So this is the 7-level model that I'm proposing today. The title is One Health. One Health is a big movement of trying to integrate different aspects of our reality, including animal health, human health, and environmental health. Even though Advaita and the One Health concept have different epistemological origins, one is more a different state of consciousness, where the other is more linear in space-time, they both embrace an attempt to unify different aspects of separateness. And this unification of systems is not new. We know from antiquity that many of the old traditional systems of medicine, which were not alternative, they actually were the traditional systems, were very integrative. They weren't traditional medicine as we know it now, so-called allopathic medicine, is the new kid on the block. More integrated systems have always been there. We know from the ancient temples of Asclepius, which were scattered around Greece and Turkey, that people would travel very long distances to go to these temples, and they would spend time in the outer sanctums getting all the purification rituals, so the outer therapies, that have to travel long distances, because it was shown that people go through some sort of hardship, if you will, to get to a healing center. There's a much greater prognosis. This has been replicated with studies with cancer patients, showing the further the travel, the better the outcomes. So people had to give up something to get something. They had to have intent. They had to mobilize themselves, which, as we know, when we try treating patients, if there's no true intent, if they don't mobilize the inner resources to get what they need and want, if they stay passive, it's very difficult to treat people. If we call that projection of will, or high resistance, if you will, in psychological terms. But when patients present in that mode, and you start working harder than the patient, you all know this, it becomes very difficult to help. So the ancient temples, they knew this, so people would travel long distances to come to these temples. They go to the outer sanctums, where they get the outer treatments, much like today you get your pills and potions. They go through purification rites and rituals, which is similar to our nutrition and detoxification protocols of more integral practices today. And then they would be shifted or moved into the inner sanctum, where the abaton was, where the dream sanctuary was, where they were required to have some inner experience, some inner signal from the unconscious that they were on a healing sort of path. And then after that was over, they would be go outside the inner sanctum and then move into the theaters, where great Greek tragedies and plays were enacted to show people that these dramas of health, healing, and transformation were archetypal, that plays would reenact the great sort of human drama from and evolution through life, and show people the archetypal sort of description of how life unfolds. And so these traditional integral systems they've always been around. Larry Darcy, through his book Reinventing Medicine, showed that modern medicine has started to embrace more integral concepts, as we all know. He called them Era 1 medicine, physical medicine, from 1850 to the present day. But actually, through Paracelsus, the application of outer remedies has been around for somewhat 500 years or so. But our true allopathic paradigm from 1850 to now And then era 2 medicine, he calls it when mind body were integrated. And then era 3, what he calls non-local medicine, where spiritual practices and spiritual insights were added to the paradigm and somewhat integrated into some therapies which exist to this day. And we know when this recent Lyme conference, ILADS conference, there was a presenter who showed that there are many research systems now trying to integrate a lot of these different disparate aspects of reality into a sort of a research mode, a research vehicle, so that they can try and look at different systems as how they interrelate and what the additive effect of different systems are. So there's lots of research going on in integration. But all of you know that, you know, when we approach patients with our old allopathic mindset, or what we call era 1 medicine, you know, the reason why you're at the ISEAI conference is because, you know, we know that this system has its limits, but it has its great virtues, but it has its limits. And these are just some of the reasons why we've sort of moved beyond that model alone. You know, we know about all the sort of the research articles that have shed some doubt on some of the previous findings, and how editors of journals are highly compromised, and how research often, you know, they hide the negative data and promote the positive data. We also know that you can't really treat patients just through physical interventions. We can't treat people as machines. We do, and sometimes very effectively. But when you're treating complex patients, you can't separate consciousness, the environment, culture, emotions, and the sort of inner core workings of the patient as they relate to their society and their culture and the world at large. You just can't isolate it. And then our allopathic model, as you know, we all know, you can't limit it just to drugs and surgery. We've got to expand our model. Majid Ali coined the phrase N squared, D squared medicine. Name of disease, name of drug. This is what we spend a lot of time doing in sort of allopathy. The other aspect that is interesting is that, you know, when you name a disease, it often limits the involvement of the patient. It often tends to shut down further inquiry. And that in itself can be problematic. When patients have lupus, for instance, it just brings together a whole mental minefield. Oh, I have lupus, or what now? It shuts down inquiry into further what we call antecedents, mediators, and triggers in the functional medicine world. And it also sort of isolates the inner reality of the patient from the outer disease. The inner healer, the inner intent sometimes just goes down, goes quiet. Oh, I have lupus. Now let's deal with lupus. And I think this is a great tragedy, which I'll explain a bit later. It separates cause and effect. You know, patients present with mast cell activation syndrome, and yes, they identify some triggers and they go on all the mast cell blockers, but it doesn't really take into account sort of building biology and EMFs and other things that may be playing a role. And then one of the great tragedies and often experienced issues is that when the disease or symptom cluster can't be named, it's dismissed as all in your head. This is a great tragedy, and being brought up more and more and made, practitioners are being made aware of this great tragedy. When allopathy runs out of diagnostic options, very often these simplistic interpretations get placed on the patient, rather than in sort of, I don't know, what other methods of inquiry should we open up, and who should we refer to in order to get more insight into this case. As we all know, allopathy has a tendency to be quite arrogant in terms of its understanding of mechanistic disease. If it can't be explained through Newtonian mechanisms, it often is said to not exist. And we all know this not to be true sometimes. I was listening to taught by Dr. Klinghardt, and he brought forward this insight, which I thought was fabulous, that he said when he was exposed to his early medical trainings, he was exposed to the regulatory forces in health and healing. And his teachers told him that there were three classes of medicine: regulation, substitution, and suppressive medicine. Suppressive being what we know, antibiotics, etc. Substitution is when something's deficient, you give something, but regulation is the awareness that the body is a self-regulating system, and you just have to find ways to assist the patient in self-regulation or to optimize function. And we know that the mind, through intent, has tremendous capacity to self-regulate as well. So I thought this was worthwhile introducing. The other thing about our model is that it ignores different stages and states of consciousness. It just treats, mechanistic Newtonian models of space-time, the body as a machine that's broken down and needs fixing, but doesn't really take into account different stages of people's lives, different states and stages of consciousness, and what can be called diseases of the soul. Now, that's a broad concept, but sometimes a patient needs another input other than what we have in our arsenal, like Prozac or Abilify or something like that. When they have a true crisis of the soul, or spiritual crisis, if you will. So an integral physician, a person who practices a more complete model, becomes aware of these dimensions of being and consciousness, and will be able to determine through their own internal sort of system of knowing which one it is and whether to prescribe Prozac or meditation, or send them to a spiritual crisis therapist, etc. Another aspect that I found quite challenging is this patient-doctor relationship. We all go to med school, naturopathic school, or whatever, a chiropractic college, and we accumulate this huge body of knowledge. And in the first half of life, when we're accumulating all this knowledge, there is this tendency to occupy what can be called the hero archetype. It's this all-knowing archetype that we can assume, knowing we know more than what the patient knows. The patient seen as an object, a closed materialistic system, being unknowing and sick. And it ignores very often, when the doctor's in the healing, in the hero archetype, ignores the part of the patient that is not sick, the healthy aspects of the patients, their value systems, their choices, the intent, and the fact that they have the capacity to mount quite a significant healing response within themselves. And when this hero, the doctor as hero archetype gets initiated, the patient often learns the sick role, becomes passive, and often, has to sort of learn this passive role in order to survive this one-sided relationship. How often have you heard our patients say, I tried to tell him, I wanted to ask him questions, and I was just shut down, and I had 5 minutes and they walked out the room. This is very common. We've all experienced it, and it's ubiquitous in our field. But the thing that's really interesting is that the doctor often, in the hero archetype, remains blindness to their own vulnerability and their own so-called woundedness, if you will. So being a doctor as hero is one archetype, but the doctor as a healer is a very different archetype. The wounded healer, if you will, I don't really like that word, but it's just the doctor is vulnerable, sees both sides, sick and the healthy parts, and they stay related to both within themselves and the patient. They don't just see organs, hormones, neurotransmitters, and psychopathology, not just a bevy of overactive mast cells or neurotransmitters, not a soulless body, but the whole being of the patient. Now, the healer archetype is embodied more by who the doctor is than what they know. We have to stay humble to that. We have to stay related to those two archetypes. Who are we, and what do we know, and how do we stay related to the patient? So there's just the diagrams explaining the difference. So this brings me to the point that the inner world of the physician becomes paramount. How much inner work has the physician himself done on himself to know what he knows, and or doesn't know? How much how much does the physician actually embody the outer symbol, the caduceus, which is actually, if you look at this, if you look at the symbol of the caduceus, this the caduceus is actually the this is the staff of Hermes, the Greek version of the Egyptian god Thoth. He is the god with a man's body and the head of a bird, and he was worshipped as the creator of the arts and sciences and music and medicine. And Greek legend has it that one day Hermes was walking along and saw two snakes that were fighting. And he took his staff and he struck it down between the two snakes, and they curled themselves around the staff, forever in contention. This is written by Robertson Davies, but held in a mutuality of power by the reconciling staff. And now the symbol of modern medicine is the staff of Hermes, separating these two opposing forces, not letting one outshine the other or allowing either to win the battle in the struggle for supremacy. And these two opposing forces are wisdom, inner wisdom, and knowledge. And the caduceus is a reminder that medical practitioners must maintain a balance between the two. Knowledge is what we learn in our toolkit. It's all that we learn from the outside. We bring many years of arduous training to bear on the diagnosis. Wisdom is what comes from within, where the doctor looks not at the disease, but at the bearer of the disease, the person who's sitting in front of you. And that is what creates the link between or unites, if you will, the healer and the patient. And this exercise makes him the true physician, a true healer, or what Robertson Davies in his book called A True Child of Hermes. The book is called A Merry Heart, How a Doctor Can Also Be a Humanist. And it's the wisdom that tells the physician how to relate to the patient and to make them a partner in their own evolution and cure. Both of these sources of wisdom must be accessed not only by healthcare providers, but also by the patient. The patient themselves must acquire as much external knowledge as they possibly can, if they're not too ill, and as from many different sources as they can, while also being cognizant of the fact that not all healing is about applying an external remedy. An inner journey is required. And then another issue about the loss of confidence in our model is that it emphasizes this disease-based model, and we ask to treat one small link in sometimes a thoroughly diseased chain of events. We patch people up and send them back into the same environment. The model has very few directors for wellness, let alone directors for living at one's maximum potential across all spectrums of the body, mind, spirit axis. And this has been known for a long time. 2012 New England Journal of Medicine. We must teach aspiring physicians about system science. We should emphasize homeostasis and health rather than only disease and diagnosis. And you know, we pay lip service to this, but it's really not organized into any roadmap or system of approach. IFM and functional medicine do a very good job, but is there more possibly? And then we come to the question, how do we even define health? If we understand that human beings are just these assemblage of molecules, but we know as humanists that they don't, they contain much more. And we can't just reduce them to materialistic bodies. So what does health mean in a multidimensional being? Interesting question. Can I be healthy if I'm spiritually malnourished? Interesting question. If a white supremacist blood work comes back normal, is he healthy? And then how many levels should a physician actually treat? Is this even our task? So as a physician, we can compartmentalize and treat one area, but as a humanist, or human being, we face a painful dilemma. We just can't do that. We know the patient is a complex, it comes in with complexity. And so the more I become a doctor, treating one little piece, the less I become a humanist, aware of all the interconnections. So traditional medicine, as we know, treats the illness, integrative medicine, more patient systems approach, but a more complete model must include the physician's own role in terms of wisdom and knowledge, both internal and external ways of knowing, as they relate to this complex human being. The Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm, but remember, there's two ways to harm: errors of commission, but also errors of omission. by what we know, but also by what we don't know. So what do we do practically in the office when we know everything is connected to everything else? What do we do when we know all illness is embedded in larger network systems and chains of pathology? How can we approach people from this perspective? So the first possibility, we see everything, suffering, physical, emotional, as unwanted, and we suppress it and we treat it. And we say, you know, illnesses sort of have no causation, they just fall out of the sky, and we get a code. And we go and find a remedy, and we subscribe to the consensual reality of our culture that just perpetuates the cycle. And this is symptom treatment and nothing to do with healing. You've all heard that the original definition of a quack is someone who treats symptoms. This is true. This is from antiquity. So that's one possibility. The second possibility is working with patients who begin to look at physical symptoms as a larger inquiry, symptoms as teleological, more as entry points into something that they need to transform. Now, I think this is a very, I have observed this over years of working with patients, is that, yes, you may present with a diagnosis, but I'm always curious, are these symptoms pointing towards something deeper within the patient's complexity that's asking to be made conscious? Is it giving voice to silence in a system? And I can quite categorically state in many cases, yes, a cold is sometimes just a cold. Nothing further is required. Or pneumonia is pneumonia. But very often, symptoms are teleological. They're pointing towards something that needs to be made conscious and worked with. I remember a patient recently, just last week, presented with MS. And she had a very difficult relationship with her father her whole life. She was never seen by her father. Her father was a very famous coach in the national sport here in Canada. And he spent all his time working with his team and was never at home. And this patient was extremely bitter and angry about this relationship. And she felt she was never seen and never fully taken into the father's confidentialities and mentored and parented by the father as she should have been. And this seeds within her whole life. Now it's interesting. She presented with MS. And so we asked a little bit more. I asked her, so when did your MS appear? And she gave me the exact date. And then I asked her, and where was your father at the time? And she suddenly, she just broke down in tears. And she said, you know what? I developed MS the day after my father was fired from the team. And so it was immediately apparent to her that she'd been ignored and neglected her whole life. The day after her father no longer had the obligation to leave home and be out of the home most of the time, he was fired. He was now at home. And she developed a symptomatology of MS the day after he was fired. And she connected the two, and she said, finally, he saw me and started to take care of me. One day, 24 hours. That, I think, is a symptom that's teleological. I don't know what else to call it. So patients who have the second possibility, they often start to ask much deeper questions and use symptoms as allies. They ask themselves questions. We all have these patients, and they're a delight to work with if their reasoning is rational. Sometimes we get people who, as we know, don't have the capacity to integrate knowledge in a way that is coherently helpful to them, and that becomes problematic. But many people are excellent self-advocates and have deep intuitions as to meaning and purposes as to the possible teleology of symptoms. And so they use a much more conscious approach, and they recognize patterns, and they approach their healing not just with physical interventions, but with a much wider array. And then you get the third possibility that others seek a state of health motivated by an aspiration for something more than just an absence of symptoms, but a positive state of well-being. Much as they've learned about illness, they now look, what is it to be healthy and well? You know, this includes a sense of inner self-regulation, competence, self-competence, not hubris, not arrogance, but they just know themselves, and they have a core self that is self-regulated. And they really are called from above. They inspired. They have a sense of meaning and purpose. They know why they get up every day, and they know they have a destiny to fulfill. And they're inspired from within. They're also aware of those parts of themselves that are often not so, don't want to own this, call this the shadow. They're aware how they project that shadow onto others. And they also know that their ultimate desire is to know themselves as much as they are capable. And they stay in their core without too much emotional fluctuations. They see crisis as blessings. They're inspired by a mission and vision bigger than themselves, to which they stay aligned. These patients are delightful to work with, as we all can attest to. Alistair Cumming, in his book, Bringing Spirituality into Your Healing Journey, said, the qualities of cancer survivors that best predict spontaneous remissions are those who are open to change, who have a commitment to daily practices, have a deep sense of themselves, and they have achieved a level of autonomy, integration, and inner authority, as opposed to those who have what has been termed in the literature as type C. And those, as we know, patients are less able to summon this strength within themselves, if you will, suppress emotions, and they tend to have projection of will, where their desire to be healed is all placed in your hands, and they tend to defer their own needs to the needs of others. They don't tend to practice a healthy balance of narcissism and altruism. Everything is about the other. And so then there's the fourth possibility, and those are who seek a level of health that is fundamentally and radically different from those. And that's the people who have what we call an expanded leap in consciousness, self-transformation rather than self-regulation. This viewpoint embraces all the previous perspectives and approaches to health, while simultaneously transcending them in a creation of a fundamentally new vision. And here people start to identify themselves with an aspect of themselves that is not only their bodies, their emotions, and their mind. If you think about it for a moment, our bodies change, our emotions come and go, our mental field changes, but to whom are those changes taking place? And the answer is you, the deepest sense of who you are. And that is a sort of a subjective experience, which you can align with. They define themselves by an attention to this more inner spiritual aspect rather than something outside of themselves. And they become attuned and surrendered to something, or to an intelligence that's greater than their own ego. They know that, the ego isn't the center of the universe. The evidence for for ourselves not being at the center of the universe against the backdrop of infinity is rather overwhelming. And people who sort of surrender to that awareness, they just know that they are just one small cog in a very large wheel and against the backdrop of infinity. They don't take themselves too seriously, but they stay aligned to what they're called to do in this incarnation. But they surrender to something bigger than themselves. That's why the ancient Greek temples often had open roofs. People open to something, an intelligence that is more than just themselves. This is very similar to what happens when I had that Satori experience. You stay open to something bigger than yourself. And what happens is when that comes through, fear completely disappears. It really does. You just have no fear of death, because you really know that we're not our bodies, our emotions, and our thoughts. You just know that to be true. And this is the deepest possibility of a transformed individual, from illness to illumination, hence the nature of my talk. Now, very often when we have these awakenings and Satoris, they're fleeting. My one lasted a few hours, and the second one lasted 10 days. So you have this awareness, and then you come back into your body and space-time and the duality of being the emotional body. But you still carry that awareness in you that there is this possibility beyond your ego-based experience. And all the great wisdom traditions are sort of teaching that is the the true state of who you are. That's the essence of Advaita. That's the essence of many of these inner esoteric traditions of spiritual practice. And this can be felt and experienced and be part of your so-called healing journey, if you will. And so we move then from the relative purpose of medicine to the ultimate purpose and possibility of healing, when we start to incorporate this deeper aspect, this sort of shifting consciousness, if you will. So a more complete roadmap doesn't look at what treatments, but looks at what about all these approaches that can be applied: the doctor, the patient, the individual, the collective, the conscious, the unconscious, states and stages of consciousness, sickness and wellness. And the healer and the patient have that roadmap. And they are aware there will be multiple risk factors at all layers and all levels. There will be many different diagnostic and therapeutic options at all layers and all levels. And so, as I mentioned, I used Ken Wilber's integral medicine model, but it's not practical, it's theoretical. Where he incorporated, Ken Wilber has incorporated many paradigms into his system of human inquiry, all the ancient sciences, physics, chemistry, systems theories. You can read the list there. And has used a system of individual outer and inner reality and collective outer and inner realities. He calls it the integral theory of everything. And one of his statements in the book Consciousness and Healing, which I recommend everybody read, he says, in the black bag will not be just 20 pills, 2 scalpels, and an orthopedic hammer, but all layers, all quadrants, all states, and all stages of consciousness. The crucial ingredient isn't all the ingredients, but the holder of the bag, the integrally informed practitioner, open to their entire spectrum of consciousness, who can acknowledge what is occurring at all levels, internally as well as externally. And they have an expanded map from dust to deity, from dirt to divinity, and from agony to ecstasy, and only then the treatment. I think it's a wonderful sort of insight into what's possible. How to practically apply that in insurance-based medicine in a short appointment, well, that's another thing. That's the logistics of how to practice in this model. So is there some way to practice medicine that surrenders not 1 ounce of the rigorously scientific, empirical, and clinical dimensions that are the cornerstone of any modern scientific system of healthcare, but also make room for other dimensions of being in the world that, if ignored, subtract from one's humanity and effectiveness as a physician? And so this was the great question that sort of arose in my evolution as a doctor, physician. And I was lucky to be exposed to many great thinkers and read many books and visit many clinics and ashrams and so forth and so on. And so the origination of the model I'm now going to teach you and show you just briefly was based on original Vedantic awareness that, and you look at the Vedantic literature, they talk about these layers and levels of a human experience, and they step them down. They call them koshas. It's an Ayurvedic or Vedantic map of human experience. And I happened, at the time when I was studying Ayurveda, also to meet Dr. Klinghardt, who has his 5 levels of healing. And I looked at his 5 levels. So I looked at this, the koshas, the bodies that I was learning and studying with Ayurveda. And I created a few more divisions. I sort of created subdivisions of the 5 and made them 7 with Dr. Klinghart's permission. And he allowed me to use his map. But I took the level 1 and made it its own, which is the environment, stage 1, I call it. And then stage 4, I separated the mind, the intellect, and created another subsection called emotion, and you'll see why in a moment. So I separated them out into 7 instead of 5. Now, this model, if you look at it, stage 1 of trying to, when you're sitting in front of a patient and you're trying to put them through a certain lens of how you're going to appreciate what they're presenting with, this is the lens I use, and it's kind of, I can't think any other way now. I think of what stage is being asked to be interpreted and uncovered. Stage 1 is all about the external body, the environment. Stage 2 is all about physical, biochemical, and structural. Stage 3 is all about energy, autonomic nervous system. Stage 4 is about emotion. Stage 5 is about intellect, ego, and defenses. Stage 6 is about the unknown aspects, the hidden aspects of our reality, which is called, for want of a better word, soul. I like the word authentic self, as opposed to the persona. And then the family systems that we inherit. And then there's a sort of archetypal myths underneath that too. And then stage 7 is this expanded state of consciousness, the so-called unified field or the grand organized design, which is this nature of reality behind our space-time physical existence. Now, Ayurveda recognizes that health is just more than the absence of disease. So they call it a vibrant state in which your mind, your body, and the environment are intimately connected and functioning in a healthy, nurturing, and supportive way. It's a harmonious relationship between all these levels, between the mind, the body, and the environment at the highest level of joy, where the mind is clear and creative, the body is healthy, vibrant, and strong, the environment the air is clean and fresh, the food is nourishing, water is clean, and relationships are loving, communicative, and nourishing. Well, this is an idealism, we know that, but it isn't. It's an idealism that can be entertained when you're working through space-time reality. And this is the model we all bring to our rooms when we see patients. But at the highest level of healing, none of those matter, because at our deepest sense of who we are, we're beyond all of that. And that is what you do evoke when you have this awakening into another level, the stage 7, if you will. So at the deepest level of stage 7, none of that will matter, because that's not who you are. So that's the roadmap. And here, this is going to make you annoyed, because I put everything into this map, which you can't read. And there's no way to make this map readable on a computer screen. But I'm going to break it down. So here's the 7 stages to health and transformation. At the bottom, I've acknowledged the contribution of Dr. Klinghardt, who has the 5 levels. And I've incorporated some of his concepts, but as I said, I've expanded them and added many, many other dimensions. So I'm going to break them down, and you'll be able to read the breakdowns for each level. So here's a patient in his 50s presenting, say, with marital conflict, alcohol abuse, and depression. And you're going to think of this patient through the 7-level model. Stage 1, environment. He's got mercury toxicity, organophosphate exposures, bite and root canal issues, tick bite history, etc., etc. Everything to do with the environment. Stage 2, looking through the functional medicine lens, everything we know, the genetics, the food sensitivities, the permeability, the mast cell, it's all there. And we do our appropriate workup accordingly. We find out that he's in the cell danger response, his mitochondria are low in numbers, etc., etc. Stage 3, we look at his electromagnetic body, if you will. We see that he's he's exposed to computers all day. He's had head injuries. His neuroquant MRI shows certain things, asymmetry from a head injury. He's got high thalamus in his neuroquant, 99th percentile with the amygdala, knowing that this person probably has mast cell activation and limbic looping through either PTSD or early childhood trauma. Stage 4, here we have it, sexually abused as a child, beaten by dad as a child, dad alcoholic, brother died when he was 12, his own son died when he was 17. This is a highly traumatized individual. And this is a very difficult case to work with because of the complexity and the defenses this person is going to bring to the interaction, especially ones of trust. One could say he has a narcissistic personality disorder, so he has a personality disorder and a mood disorder. And then from the family system, the stage 6, from the family soul, there was all sorts of inherited trauma that was brought through. And stage 7, he had no connection to anything other than his own suffering. This patient is complex and difficult to treat. But if we have a roadmap, we can sort of orientate ourselves to each layer and each level and then work accordingly, giving ourselves, a year to sort of sort through a lot if the patient has the ego strength to survive that level of complexity. And so we have to often modulate our own knowing of this individual, where their weaknesses and strengths lie, and then adjust ourselves accordingly. So when a patient like this walks in, we're all familiar. We take the history, we look for all the antecedents, mediators, and triggers. We create timelines, we posit a working hypothesis, we do all the tests, and then we jump into treatment. Now, I'm just going to suggest, before we take this approach, that, before we rush in to treat these specific symptoms, clusters, or diagnoses across all layers and levels, that we step back and ask a couple of questions of ourselves. When we're going to look through this much larger lens, there's certain things that I think we should bring to the dynamic in the room with the patient. So here's the things that I sort of need to remind myself of many times a day, and sometimes forget. When I'm in the doctor as hero archetype, which is not difficult to do, you get humbled. You often get patients who will humble you, you get challenged, and then you drop back into the awareness that, yes, we can occupy doctor as hero, but we also doctor as, patient. We have to be aware of our own hubris and our own humility when you're actually dealing with complex patients, because you will be pulled back and forth by so many dynamics that are being thrown at you. So here's some of the things I think are important. Are you present, related, listening, resonant, embodied, and attuned? Piaget's social engagement theory. Does your face reflect that you are listening to that patient? Is there trust established? Are these patients being seen by you? Were they ever seen by anybody? The patient I mentioned before, he was never seen by his father. His brother died. He got lost. His mother was so traumatized. Then his own son died. Can you imagine the level of trust he has in outer parental or in external authority figures? Not much. You've got to be aware of the projection of these unresolved early developmental issues of patients. The patient, as I mentioned, he had so many unresolved complexes that he projected onto the exchange. It was very difficult to negotiate some of these complexities. How many layers and how many levels are needing your attention? Are symptoms teleological? Are they pointing to something in the system, as I mentioned before? And then what stage of life are they in? First half or second half? This is a very important question I ask, and often comes up a lot. If you look at the trajectory of life, the first half of life is very different from the second half of life. In the first half of life, you've got this developmental brain, you've got the so-called triune brain, you've got the reptilian brain, which is fight, flight, you've got the limbic brain, which is emotional, and then you've got the mammalian brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is the inhibitory brain. And if you look at the trajectory of patients' attachments and needs, the first 10 years, the child needs to be seen by the mother, in particular the mother, not so much the father, although the father does play a role. And the child attunes to the demands, to the gaze of the mother. And they tune and attune the mother's right prefrontal cortex attunes with the child's right prefrontal cortex, and a sense of attachment and safety is created. And Sieber and Fisher shown in the fabulous book, Neurofeedback Development, that if the mother and the child attune in the first 10 years of life, and there's no breaks in the bond, that creates in the child a right prefrontal cortex maturity, and they develop a sense of self. Now, if the mother's present and attunes with the child, because the child looks to the mother, attunes with the mother, feels safe, looks away, self-soothes, self-regulates, then looks back to the mother. And this goes on for years. In a daughter, up to 30 years. In a son, later, 35 years. The child is always trying to attune to the parental expectation. Now, if the mother's present and the mother is attuned, the child feels safe. So the first 10 years of life is all about fight, flight, and safety. If the child's safe in themselves, they then start to develop a core strength and a stable sense of self, which they then take into the next 10 years, which is developing an identity and a sense of self with peer groups. Now, the father is often responsible for attuning the child into the second half, the second decade of life, when the limbic brain becomes attuned. But if that child then gets exposed to bullying and ridicule, that limbic brain is highly traumatized, and that's when you get all these anxiety states and OCD states, because there's no self-regulation at that level of development. And then in the third decade of life, you achieve a certain sense of autonomy. You're starting to lay down your prefrontal cortex, your inhibitory brain, where you inhibit the fight flight of the first 10 years. You inhibit the fears of the second decade, and you start to develop a sense of autonomy and independence, where you're no longer looking to parental guidance. The parent is the external prefrontal cortex for 30 years. Child's always looking for self-regulation. But then as the child develops and leaves the father's or mother's house, they have their own prefrontal cortex to inhibit their fears and their emotional fluctuations and their fight-flight responses. That's a healthy developing ego self. Now, patients in the first half of life are often taken up by these biological imperatives. And there's no, they're very different. It's the ego development of the child to develop a coherent sense of self. It's very different from the second half of life, which we call more of a soul part of a person's life, where they are, whatever develops in the first half of life, particularly if there was high drama and trauma, the child will often develop what's called a provisional sense of self, where they leave the authentic instinctual self behind, and then they make themselves adjust to cope and survive. And so that we call the provisional self, and that becomes the ego, the operational sense of self that takes them through life, which can be very highly developed, but the core instinctual self often gets left behind. Now, it's been my experience that in the second half of life, symptoms will often bring a patient back to re-examine that part of themselves that they left behind in order to develop a provisional operational sense of self. This happens all the time when I take histories and look at the teleological impact of symptoms. And I think we need to, as practitioners, be aware that treating a patient in the first half of life, now I'm talking about patients with complex mind-body type illnesses, not just bronchitis. I'm talking about complex patients. Patients in the first half of life, they're driven by biological imperatives. Freud talked about drives. Adler talked about drives. Jung was the only one to talk about the drives of the soul. Jung would not see a patient psychologically until the second half of life, because he said there was nobody home. He said that, in the first half of life, you're just driven to become something. And so you've got hormones at your disposal, and he said there was no true consciousness to work with. And I'm not saying that younger people are unconscious, of course they are. But you're being driven to become something and succeed in life. But it's only in the second half of life, when we are naturally drawn to become more aware of our true authentic selves, that we can really start to do more of the inner work, so to speak, because we're not being driven to succeed in the outer world. And I think this has sort of changed my practice when I start to look through that lens. I think it's an important lens. We can't ignore it. So these series of questions, what is the strength of that person? What ego strength? Are they fragile? And do they project their will? Are they highly resistant? These patients are different. You've got to be aware of them. How defended are they? What unconscious dynamics are they wanting to be made conscious? Are they ego defended or soul defended? There's a difference which I don't have time to go into. The soul defended people are far more traumatized. Are they able to self-regulate, or are they in their core, or do they fragment into different ego states? Do they freeze? Do they dissociate? Are there personality disorders? And then asking other questions. What is the actual content of their internal dialogue? How polarized are they into black and white thinking? Is there a need for a new narrative, a new story that needs to be told? I often don't, I see patients, complex patients, they often don't heal unless they have a new image, a new story, a new internal dialogue, even sometimes an awakening that is physiologically experienced, not cognitive, but a true awakening to a new reality. And that's not a fragmented ego state or dissociated ego. It's truly a transcendent experience. What is their capacity for self-efficacy? How well informed is it? Is it rational? Is it magical or wishful thinking? Are you, as a medical provider, able to create salience and relevance? Do you educate your patients as to the complexity of their presentation, or you just tell them what to do? The difference. You all know that education goes a long way in creating so-called compliance, because there's salience, there's relevance. And what are they asking of you? To treat disease, to make symptoms go away? Or are they asking to be assisted in their quest for full human flourishing? It's important to know. What archetype do you occupy? Are you in your Dr. Hero or Doctor's healer mode? Do you stay in your core? Do you take no credit, take no blame? Stay true to your own chief aim, vision, destiny? Just keep loving what you do and don't get too elated when people praise you and when people damn you. I mean, doctors are subject to lots of projection, lots. A patient comes in the door, praises you. I know, keep yourself in your core because the next one's going to come and damn you. So you just don't oscillate between, seeking praise and getting too upset when when people go at you, which they do in social media. I mean, rate MD, great. People can project all of their unresolved parental conflicts onto authority figures. And don't forget, we as MDs or naturopaths or chiropractors, we carry a big potential for large parental projections onto us, unconscious projections of well, patients will project onto you that which they haven't resolved with their parents. One of the great questions always ask a patient, how are you related to your mother and father? If there's a complexity there, or they've never seen their mother or never seen their father, that's a different patient than one who's been seen, loved, and nourished by a patient. We know that through attachment theory and early trauma. And then the last question is, where do we enter into this complex system when patients present with this kind of complexity? Where do we end? What level? We enter at the level of toxicology? Do we enter at the level of soul? Do we enter at the level of ego development? This is what we need to ask of ourselves. Often when you sit enough in the field of a patient, it becomes clear. It unravels itself. And it's only through a phenomenological inquiry that so the answers will emerge. You can't walk in with a plan. You've got to stay related. You've got to look the patient in the eyes, and you've got to listen, and then see what emerges phenomenologically in the field as to where this system is asking to be unraveled or order created, if you will, out of some chaos. And so here's what we do. The first level is the so-called extended body. The rivers are my blood, the rainforest produces oxygen in my lungs, the earth is my body. Every time we breathe in and out, we're exchanging tons of information with our environment. Just look at COVID, see how much gets exchanged through droplets, etc. Someone calculated that with every breath we exchange 10 billion trillion atoms. It's remarkable. And where were those atoms before I breathed them out? They were, in my liver, my kidney, my spleen, my bones, my brain. Deepak used to say in his talks, we're in an involuntary organ transplantation program. COVID has brought us this awareness. It's too close to home. And it's been calculated, if you do the math, that by the time you leave a room, we walk out there with at least 1 million atoms that came into the room with somebody else. We're constantly exchanging our bodies with each other and with the environment at large. Everybody here is the atoms that were once in the body of Jesus Christ or Mahatma Gandhi or Saddam Hussein or a lion in the Kalahari Desert or Donald Trump for that matter, or the notorious RBG, if you will. So when you say this is my body, it's somewhat of an illusion. It's a limited perspective of who we are. So the air we breathe, the food we eat, the water we drink is densely packed with a multitude of potentially carcinogenic and immune system depleting toxins. We know that. I mean, fabulous lectures this weekend on that from some of the world authorities. So You know, the great rishis of Ayurveda say, I'm not in this world, the world is in me. It's not metaphysics, it's science. We are continuously in exchange. And so we have a responsibility as well, to know that there is no there out there. It's us and out there, and we the same. And it's incumbent upon us in this field to be environmentalists, activists in the highest sense. We have a responsibility because we know this to be true. Every time we drive our car when we could be walking, every time we throw away a bottle when we could be recycling, we should be and must be on the forefront of environmental movement. And I do believe ICR is really carrying that mantle, of course. Mark Hyman's new book, Food Fix, was fabulous when he outlined how our food supply is in the hands of about 12 CEOs of big companies. It's very sobering, you know. And we have a need for all this regenerative farming, etc. So that's the extended body is the world outside of ourselves. And I just put together this quick slide. These are some of the toxicology, environmental labs I use, some of the treatments I found helpful. We all familiar with these, you know these, I just wrote these down. I originally had much more time to speak and I was going to go into more detail, but unfortunately that can't happen today. The second level is the level of the physical body. We know that our body is nothing other than DNA wrapped in food with some structure. Macro and micronutrients influence this dramatically, we know this. And so when we look at the physical body as such, we have to sort of, there's certain things that really have emerged in my practices, so at the core of this awareness, because this is where most people will enter. They'll enter into stage 2, the physical symptomatology, biochemistry. And so we do our allopathic history and our functional medicine history. We do a complete functional medicine workup with all the tests we can. And that stupid saying that we're all aware of, you can't manage what you can't measure, it's so true. Now, some practitioners are excellent at what's called ART, autonomic response testing, and don't test as much. I personally am more familiar and more skilled at test interpretation. So I try and get as many tests as I possibly can to explore the cartography of what's being presented. People often, and of course, you know, people's budgets are limited, so you have to adjust accordingly. But if you can test, it really helps you pull in all these disparate parts and create a more cohesive roadmap for helping patients. So the complete functional medicine workup, we're all familiar with it. I do feel that the different diets, you need to know them all. You need to know about fasting, mimicking, intermittent fasting. I personally find that the paleo autoimmune low histamine diet to be at the bedrock of trying to get people to down-regulate all the inflammatory issues they usually come up with. But you've got to know the histamine diet, the oxalate diet, the SC, the Ayurvedic diet. A Vata person in Ayurveda is very different from a Kapha or Pitta person. You've got to know the different tastes and flavors that these different Ayurvedic doshas, if you will, do better with. I do think it's important. Mitochondrial medicine, the cell danger response, membrane medicine, Robert Navarro's theory, unbelievable, changed the way I practice. We're now able to do the labs that look at some of these markers, and I do them on every patient almost. Working with Dr. Afrin and mast cell patients who now we start talking about pentads and recently septads. Pentad patients are patients with Ehlers-Danlos and POTS and dysautonomia and autoimmunity with chronic infections and cranial cervical instabilities. This is important, you know, many POTS patients get undiagnosed. You've got to take the blood pressures lying and standing. You've got to ask about Ehlers-Danlos and do Brighton scores. These are very important little bits and pieces I've picked up over time that one puts into one's toolbox, if you will. And then sleep and exercise medicine, we all know that. Peptides, exosomes, stem cells are, you know, new kids on the block, and there's even more now. We've got psychedelics in there too. You know, there's so much going on. It's unbelievable. Ketamine, etc. Dentistry, you've got to know dentistry kind of, you've got to start learning about dentistry and how to read a two-dimensional panorex and maybe a 3D cone beam, but best to work with a biological dentist. You've got to know a lot. Know lots about nuclear chiropractics, craniosacral, vision therapy, and know your immune system basics. Very important to know how to down or upregulate accordingly. And then stage 3 is the electromagnetic body. We all this level, we have this layer of prana, they call it in Ayurveda, this level of energy, it's level of vitality. And there's a difference between a corpse and a human being, is that some intelligence is flowing through it, which needs to be nourished and interacted with in every way. Just as we are metabolizing food, we're metabolizing sight and touch and smell, etc. And we have to, know some of these theories and some of these insights. These energy fields that come from the body that work in concert, and it's been shown that they actually govern biological processes. We know the work of Albert Popp that there's a biofield surrounding the body, so it's coming from what they believe to be DNA. So this whole concept of the aura is actually real. Local fields, meridians, they regulate the flow of energy within the body. And these fields operate as a spectrum. They can include electrical, electromagnetic, and subtle energies. And these do correspond with a wide range of scientific data and field reports. And I learned from Dr. Klinghardt, from his work with Dr. Popp and others, that our matter, our actual biochemical reactions are controlled by this energy component which shapes matter. Apparently there's an electromagnetic sort of field that stands as a standing wave outside of your body actually, and at where they intersect, it actually is where the control of biochemical reactions occur. And we know from Harold Burr in the 90s, he measured these electrical fields like around an unfertilized salamander egg and found it was shaped like a mature salamander. And so he showed that often these electromagnetic patterns often undergo destruction before the physical body, before physical illness is followed. And so when we look at this electromagnetic field, we've got to know about the brain. We've got to know about the autonomic nervous system. We've got to know about neuroquant MRIs, heart rate variability. And the QEEG work, which we do here at the clinic, is extremely important. I love to correlate neuroquant MRIs with QEEGs. You can often tell the biography of a patient just by looking at what's showing up in a neuroquant and what's showing up in a QEEG. We also have to know about interference fields, scars, tonsillectomies, tissues that have damage to them, which actually interfere with some of these fields. And we have to know about man-made electromagnetic fields. This becomes part of our workup, is getting a building biologist to go into a home and measure electrical fields, magnetic fields, EMFs, and dirty electricity. We also have to know about the mind, because the mind, through the stress response or through intention, can sort of change the electrical field. And through upregulation of the HPA axis, for instance, can cause cortisol to cause a leaky gut, as we know, leaky brain, leaky mitochondria. So we have to know about stress responses, mental fields, and their downstream effects on the electromagnetic body. And this is the so-called regulatory medicine that Dr. Klinghardt mentioned, where we use interventions, homeopathy, acupuncture, all forms of regulatory medicine, of which we learned through, not through allopathic medicine, but through other studies. Sometimes with brain injury, we do need to do neurocognitive testing. I do quite a bit of this, particularly with traumatic brain injuries. And then now we switch, from the outer world to the inner world, and we start looking at the emotional fields of the body. And Candace Pert was the first to show that thoughts create our physiology through first electrical and then chemical signals of neuropeptides. Every time we think a thought, it's turned into chemical. And the Ayurvedic saying, if you want to look at what your experiences were like in the past, look at your body now. There's a blueprint. If you want to know what your body is going to look like in the future, look at your experiences now. Traditional Chinese medicine teaches us that emotions are linked to specific organs. You know that a patient who's been sexually abused, particularly females, often has a lot of pelvic symptomatology. Anger and the liver, very much linked. You'll see this a lot. And also grief. I had a woman who gave up a baby for adoption, and she presented with asthma. She dealt with the adoption guilt and her asthma cleared, nothing else. It's just linking emotion to organs. This is a real thing. It's not just speculative on the part of traditional Chinese medicine. And many studies have done, showing how emotions are linked to biochemistry. Anger has specific, upregulation of inflammatory cytokines, laughter, downregulation, etc., etc. And in this, we know from this world that of the emotional body that we've got to start looking at early developmental traumas, the adverse childhood effects of trauma, and what effect they have on the body. We know that there's an increased incidence of all sorts of diseases with adverse childhood experiences and early trauma. And we've got to learn about trauma-based therapies, integrative body psychotherapy, somatic experiencing, family constellation work, early developmental trauma work. And we use a wide array of therapeutics in this domain. So we can't ignore the level of complexity that dysregulated emotions bring into the interview. Level 5 is everything to do with the intellectual body, or the so-called individual mind and ego development, the operational sense of the self. We have this individual I, which is interrelated to biosocial networks. This is a very important part of how we interrelate. Is the person's ego sense of self strongly developed? Is it fragile? Because it depends how you interrelate with a person as to whether this is true or not. Everybody has a value system. You need to know your patient's value systems. Every people have different personality types. Every person has different constitutional types. I find it quite important to know about Ayurvedic types. A Vata patient is very different from a Kapha patient, is very different from a Pitta patient, as to how you interrelate with them. And with Myers-Briggs typology, a person who's an introvert is very different from an extrovert. A person who is judging is very different from somebody who's perceiving, and so forth and so on. A feeling type is very different from a thinking type. And it's important when you're starting to work with patients to sort of know some of these typologies in order to work with them accordingly. And so the individual mind, the individual mind, which is located to the body, takes in information through the 5 senses, transforms that through the filters of values and core beliefs, morals, ethics, and culture. And then in the step-down transformer, the brain transforms that into reality. But also the individual mind or ego takes in information, if you will, from above, from internal images that it's created in stories we've told ourselves about early developmental experiences. And then we filter that through our personalities, our constitutional types, and provisional selves. Now, our ego states are usually provisional selves. And then we translate that into reality, and thus physiology. Our conscious core beliefs about our ego cells mobilize biochemistry, causing neurons to fire together. We often have unconscious core beliefs, so-called complexes, that come up from below, and then these then create our outer reality. We have to know how to work with this intellectual body through different interventions. ISTDP is a form of psychotherapy that I respect and use, I refer out to other people to use. ISTDP looks at the defenses of a patient. Patients are often presented with a cluster of symptomatologies which are masking a deeper inability to feel deeper emotion. For instance, anxiety. Anxiety is not an emotion. It's a defense against feeling deeper emotions like shame, guilt, anger, rage. And so an ISTDP practitioner will ask patients certain questions and work with them in the transference and countertransference of the relationship to try and see how symptoms may be presenting based on defenses that are being crystallized, preventing them from uncovering what they really are trying to feel. I find ISTDP a fascinating and very deep form of therapy, but difficult to do. I use other methods, the DiMartini method and others. So individuals have truly miraculous responses to healing in their physiology are the ones who have a shift in perception, in consciousness. They extract a new set of information from their perceptions, who change their beliefs about their perceptions, and hence radically reorganize their downstream physiology as a consequence. At this level of the soul, we have to know about the cartography of the soul. This is the objective reality of the soul that Jung talked about. We have the outer ego that orientates itself to space-time, and we have the deeper unconscious aspects of the shadow and the self. And it's only in midlife that often the soul body or the authentic self wants to emerge. And very often in a therapeutic encounter, you've got to know the difference. Symptoms will often present themselves at this midlife stage, as I mentioned, in order for a person to transition from first half to second half. And if they hold on too tight to first half of life ego-based demands, they will often attract challenges in their physiology in order to draw attention to the fact that transition is needed. You know, in Greek mythology, the seat of the soul was on your knees, and you often see this. People who attract tragedies, they'll attract physical ill health, they'll attract divorces, they'll attract bankruptcies. They'll be challenged to force to change the trajectory of their life from the first half to the second half. Because if they continue on the first half of life endeavors, as the hormones would retreat, they will fail to recognize the calling of the soul to become more whole and more developed. We naturally evolve as we mature to integrate parts of ourselves that we left behind. Our provisional selves get integrated or get made conscious, and we start to integrate parts of ourselves that we previously were not aware of. We become more authentically ourselves. We start to deal with something called shadow projections, parts of ourselves that we don't necessarily like. Those parts of ourselves that we don't necessarily like, we often attract on the outside. And we have to deal with them until we learn to integrate them. We have 4,500 traits. Every trait serves as a purpose, and until we can learn to integrate all traits, we're not really able to be authentically ourselves. And that's a methodology, and that's something we have to learn. The other thing at the level of the soul is the family soul. We often inherit. Here's the statement here. We have to take a multi-generational history to determine neuropsychiatric conditions. The experience of a parent before conceiving markedly influences both the structure and function in the nervous system of subsequent generations. So at the level 6 of healing, and this is one of the most profound insights I've ever sort of experienced, is that what the ancestors bring to the table will often be expressed in the individual, but have nothing to do with them. It's in the system. They inherit epigenetically trauma in the system. And sometimes when you start to see the dynamics and the entanglements of the family system, and the patient is made conscious through family constellation therapy of these entanglements, and they get an entirely new insight into what preceded them, it entirely rewrites their story and their personal dialogue and their beliefs about themselves. They're able to really let go of the narrative that they brought into the treatment room. This has been very profound. I used to every year do a workshop with Mark Walden, who's one of the masters at this work, whereby we would look at illness and inherited family trauma. And very often we could see how illnesses have their origin in inherited entanglements in family systems. So I encourage all of you, if you're fascinated by this, to not ignore inherited epigenetic family trauma. Bert Hellinger was, of course, the great pioneer of this work, and his work is immensely helpful and worth reading. When a patient shifts their judgment, criticism, and projections to understanding and see their parents, for instance, in a greater light, you know, they may have hated their mother, but when they start to see how their mother got very little from her mother, something opens in them and they stop telling the same story. They see their mother with more compassion. So when a parent, a person, an individual is placed in a much larger family system, a new image is created, and it absolutely changes downstream metabolites. It really does work that way. And these trickle-down effects do go down into physicality and to biochemistry, and a whole new healing potential is set in motion. And so this summary slide sort of summarizes lots of what I've said. When we work at all layers or levels, from our family system, from our ancestors, we may inherit events, as well as when we're born, we inherit early childhood bonding experiences, either positive or negative, which then influence our beliefs, our values, our internal dialogue. We have 60,000 thoughts a day, most of them the same as the day before. When those change, it creates a different downstream metabolism. And then our defenses, that then influences the content of our thoughts, which creates a specific image and a narrative, a story, our so-called internal dialogue, which then alters the autonomic nervous system, peripheral and central nervous system, and the HPA axis and immune system, that then in the brain transforms first into electrical signals, then chemical messages in the form of neuropeptides, neurohormones, that then interface with protein receptors in the nucleus of the cell mitochondria, that encode specific genes to translate proteins, that transform into enzymes, neuropeptides, immunoglobulins, hormones, connective tissue, that then become you, that beat your heart, breathe your lungs, procreate your offspring, and heal. Or if you further increase your allostatic load, triggers from the environment, etc., create further cell danger response or hyperfreeze in Porges' dorsal vagal theory, that then create more symptoms of diseases. So in the middle of this, we've got to enter into the system and start to unpack and uncover what's going on at all layers and all levels that could create either health, healing, and a sense of living at one's maximum potential, or further increase and down-regulate the cell danger response and the hyperfreeze response and make things sicker and worse. We have to enter into this system and trying to unravel what's going on and what to do. This is the skill of a fully informed practitioner who's got a bigger roadmap than just the functional medicine roadmap. This is a patient who presented, for instance, just looking at the family systems issues, she presented with all the symptoms that we know many people present with. She was vita imbalanced, she had POTS, she had jaw infection, she had chronic pain, she'd worked with everybody. She still remained very symptomatic. She had an MSQ of 102. And now the family story was her dad was a drug addict. He used drugs. The parents were unhappy. Dad left when she was 2 and then died from drugs at 10. And the story in the system that dad was useless. He was a drug addict, killed himself. She seldom thought of him. When she did it, it was very negative. And so she had a break in attachment with her mom because the mom was always busy with the father. It took her eyes off the patient. She was merged and identified with the deceased father. She could not love him overtly because he was terrible, so to speak. That was the family myth. He was a no-good drug addict. So she loved him covertly, but by becoming sick like him. Children have a massive unconscious loyalty to their parents, no matter what the parents do. She would say to herself unconsciously, this is not conscious, Dad, you didn't live a full life. I won't either. I'll suffer like you so you won't have to do it alone. This is the unconscious loyalty of a child to a parent. So when this was uncovered in a history taking, she tuned into the sensations of her body. She felt more cohesive. She was able to feel more integration. She felt the vibration. And this became her, the sense of self. This became her daily practice. And she started to then visualize attachment to mother appropriately and started to bring her father back into life. She placed the father of her dad on her desk as an altar to him, inviting him in. She went to her grave. She visited his family. And all of a sudden, this part of herself, and now remember, she's half her father. So this half of herself, which she'd cut off and ignored, now all of a sudden came up and alive and introduced energetically into her system the part of herself that she'd ignored and rejected. And she then did, level 3 or stage 3 work. She did M-wave, she did develop coherence, she saw somatic experiencing practitioner. She developed a stable sense of self and developed a so-called window of tolerance. And she said, these insights have changed my life. I'm asking Dad to guide me. She just started to develop a core self, an increased window of tolerance. Her symptoms calmed down. Her POTS was under control. Of course, we did all the biological functional medicine, you know, salt and stockings and Florinef and everything we do at level 2. But it was this insight that really had a trickle-down effect. And after a certain period of time, her MSQ had come down to 30. Level 7, spiritual body, that's, you know, about 100 years ago, there was, as I said, this infusion of ancient souls. They said, you know, things aren't really physical. Behind this mask of molecules, behind this facade of materialism, there's this vast domain of energy and information. And we can relate to it. You know, it beats your heart, it breathes your lungs, it moves birds' wings, it creates black holes, it creates supernovas. And this intelligence underlies all matter. It has no limits. Larry Dossey's new book is called One Mind. He says that everything behind the appearances of separateness is this one mind. It's connected and infinite in all directions. And you can experience it directly through these satoris or awakenings or precognitions, as mentioned. And it's not located within my mind or my body. My consciousness is not limited to my brain or my body. It's the umbrella to all individual minds. And this is a level of transcendence that can be experienced. And once it's experienced, it's the ultimate healing, because there's no fear of anything, because you realize that it is all that. And we manifest from that. And our separateness is somewhat an illusion of the 5 senses. This is not, can't be cognitively felt. It has to be transcendently experienced. And so, in summary, in the 7 stages to health and transformation, stages 1 to 5, conscious, space-time, ego. Stages 6 to 7, unconscious, systemic, soul. Each level has its own order and its own laws, which need to be understood. The lower 5 levels belong to the personal realm, the conscious ego self. The 6th and 7th to the systemic and transpersonal realms, unconscious. The higher levels have an organizing influence on the lower levels. This is very important to realize. The lower levels supply the energy to the higher levels and create boundaries for the individual to exist in. Resolution of issues at the higher levels trickle down to the lower levels. This is so true. You can't treat POTS and hope for family system trauma to be healed. But if you heal family system trauma, POTS may resolve. This is very much a rule that I was taught by Dr. Klinghardt and which exists to this day. So the 7 stages to health and transformation. The purpose of an inclusive model is not to create a larger tool bag of treatment strategies, whether they're allopathic or integrative. The purpose is not to add 10 minutes of prayer to radiation treatment and believe we are fulfilling a more holistic imperative. We don't necessarily need more tools and hammers in our toolkit. The purpose is to create as large as possible a diagnostic and therapeutic roadmap that relates directly to the patient's experience and request, and ask what is it about all the approaches that can be applied to healing, where both the doctor and the patient, the individual and the collective, and both sickness and wellness are considered and included. The crucial ingredient isn't all the ingredients, but the holder of the bag, a transformation in the practitioner. The integrally informed practitioner is open to the entire spectrum of consciousness. They can acknowledge what is occurring at all levels and all layers, internally as well as externally, as much as is possible. And with both confidence and humility, aware within themselves of the doctor as hero, as well as the wounded healer, and be aware of projection of theirs and the patient's complexes, and attempt to lower as much as possible errors of commission as well as errors of commission. In the black bag, as will not be one mechanic to one machine, one plumber to one broken faucet, but one human being to another. Not just 20 pills, 2 scalpels, and an orthopedic hammer, but all layers, all quadrants, all states, and all stages of consciousness. They will have an expanded map from dust to deity, from dirt to divinity, and from agony to ecstasy. Only then the treatment. That's Ken Wilber. And what is most obvious is that this does not happen without a profound inner shift in consciousness and a radical shift in the beliefs of the patient about what is humanly possible. These beliefs are contained in the internal dialogue at stage 5. This is accompanied by an entirely new narrative and image, replacing the one from the past and what is possible for the future, and rewiring through new neural circuitry a different set of downstream metabolic modulators. And I remember Deborah, a dear patient who died from stage 4 breast cancer after 7 years of treatment. And she had achieved a profound sense of health and healing in all areas of her life at the moment of her death. She had experienced this shift in consciousness, one mind, and I believe she died fully healed. This is not um, this is completely possible. And so we move from the relative purpose of medicine to relieve symptoms and to cure disease, to fix people, to eradicate tumors, to normalize blood tests, alleviate pain, create clear CAT scans, and prolong life. These are the culturally sanctioned notions of what physicians are supposed to do. And we all, asked to do this with the least amount of effort, expense, and sense of personal responsibility. And this is compounded by the consensual reality that all illness is negative to be eradicated. And illness is not being used as information for self-transformation. We move from the relative to the absolute purpose to assist healing the physical body so that people can live out their lives in a state of maximum potential, in the fulfillment of love and purpose, and feel the love, joy, wisdom, and compassion in their lives more fully. We achieve this not by medicating a symptom away, but by using it as feedback mechanisms to let us know where we need to become more conscious. We lean into the sharp points of our lives. And we assist in creating a culture in which spirit and energy have equal priority than matter and the body. We assist in cleaning our connection to this infinite field, one mind, to which we are all connected. And if we fail and people die from physical diseases, there is no tragedy, because we can die fully healed with an open heart and a state of present moment awareness, with the realization that our true self, our one mind, is connected with something greater than our individual self. It's non-local, it's outside of space-time, it's immortal and eternal, and therefore incapable of death. I apologize for going over time. Thank you for your attention. And I do believe I will now be taking questions. Thank you. This is for you. I'm that lady. Appreciate it.